America's 13th largest city is one you've probably never thought about. Fort Worth is bigger than San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston, yet it operates in near total invisibility. Most of the country assumes it's just a suburb of Dallas, 30 miles to the east. It isn't. Fort Worth is a fiercely independent metropolis built on cattle, railroads, and oil, the volatile, chaotic industries that stable cities avoided. By every conventional metric of urban development, Fort Worth makes absolutely no sense. It possesses one of the most highly regarded walkable downtowns in America, while simultaneously devouring the prairie with endless suburban sprawl and massive logistics hubs. It's a city running two completely opposite planning philosophies at once. To understand how Fort Worth operates as two different cities simultaneously, we have to look at how it stubbornly refused to die. Fort Worth was designed to fail. In 1849, the United States Army established Camp Worth as a military outpost on the Trinity River, deliberately placing it at the absolute edge of civilization. Just west of the fort stood the Cross Timbers, a dense, nearly impenetrable forest of post oak and blackjack oak that formed a natural barrier separating settled eastern Texas from the untamed western plains. This wasn't a forest in the romantic sense. Early settlers and travelers documented it as a tangled, scrubby woodland that clawed at wagons and swallowed trails, a maze of gnarled branches and thorny undergrowth that turned a day's journey into a week of suffering. It was both a psychological and physical wall, marking the precise point where civilization stopped and something wilder began. The fort was supposed to guard that boundary. It was one link in a chain of military outposts meant to protect settlers pushing westward after the Mexican-American War. Officers arrived, built their fortifications, and waited for the wave of settlement they were meant to defend. It lasted 4 years. In 1853, the military abandoned the outpost entirely. The frontier had moved west faster than anyone expected, rendering the fort's position strategically obsolete. The army packed up, marched out, and left behind a scatter of wooden structures and a handful of settlers who had nowhere else to go. The settlement had no navigable water. The Trinity River at this point was barely functional for transport. It had no agricultural advantage. The surrounding terrain was harder to clear and less fertile than the prairie lands to the east. It occupied the wrong side of the geographic barrier that every successful city knew to avoid. Fort Worth existed in the shadow of its own abandonment, a town with literally no reason to survive. Consider the contrast 30 miles to the east. Dallas sat in open prairie with flat, farmable land and easier access to river navigation. It had the geography that urban planners recognize as foundational, a natural crossroads, accessible resources, defensible terrain that didn't fight you. Dallas made sense. Fort Worth occupied rough, broken land at the edge of a forest that blocked expansion. It was positioned at the boundary of what was possible, not at the center of what was profitable. Most American cities that thrived began as strategic military positions that remained strategic. San Francisco guarded a harbor that never stopped mattering. San Antonio anchored mission and military infrastructure that evolved into permanent settlement. Fort Worth's foundational institution gave up on it almost immediately. This wasn't a minor setback. The fort's abandonment removed the only economic engine the settlement had. Military outposts brought supply contracts, troop payrolls, and the psychological assurance that civilization had staked a claim. Without it, Fort Worth was just a collection of buildings in difficult terrain, sitting on the wrong side of a natural barrier with no water route, no agricultural surplus, and no institutional backing. The Cross Timbers loomed. That forest wasn't just an obstacle, it was a verdict. It declared that expansion stopped here, that the land beyond was too costly to settle, too rough to farm, too far from markets to matter. Other towns read that verdict and built themselves on the safer side. Fort Worth was left holding the wrong position. Standard urban planning wisdom suggests cities succeed through geographic advantage, access to water, flat buildable land, proximity to trade routes, natural resources within reach. Fort Worth had none of these. It had rough topography, a forest barrier, an abandoned military post, and settlers too stubborn or too broke to leave. The city exists because geography said it shouldn't. Every conventional metric of urban viability suggested Fort Worth would fade into the prairie like 100 other failed frontier camps. The military had already written it off. The economic logic was absent. The natural advantages were missing. Fort Worth survived anyway. After the Civil War, Fort Worth found temporary salvation in cattle. The Chisholm Trail funneled massive herds north toward Kansas railheads, and Fort Worth became the last significant stop before the Red River crossing. The city transformed into a rough, dirty hub of cowboys, cattle pens, and saloons, a district known as Hell's Half Acre that cemented Fort Worth's reputation as lawless and expendable. Then the Panic of 1873 nearly killed it. The Texas and Pacific Railway, which was supposed to connect Fort Worth to national markets, halted construction 26 miles short of the city. Without the railroad, Fort Worth faced economic extinction. Dallas newspapers mocked the dying town, with one lawyer famously claiming he had seen a panther sleeping in Fort Worth's deserted streets, the ultimate insult suggesting the place was so dead that wildlife had reclaimed it. Fort Worth's response was pure defiance. Citizens adopted the panther as their official symbol, turning the mockery into identity. Then they did something almost unprecedented. They built the railroad themselves. Business leaders and laborers organized community work crews, raised local capital through bonds, and physically graded the land and laid 26 miles of track by hand. The line reached Fort Worth in July 1876. This wasn't just survival, it was the creation of a civic mythology that defined the city's psychology. Fort Worth learned it could not rely on institutions, geography, or outside support. It would build its own infrastructure through sheer, stubborn force, no matter how chaotic or desperate the method. Fort Worth's downtown today is the opposite of what its history suggests it should be. Sundance Square spans 35 blocks of meticulously preserved early 20th century architecture, creating one of the most walkable urban environments in Texas. The district features human-scaled streets, concealed parking, and active street life that urban planners consistently rank among the best examples of downtown revitalization in America. This didn't happen through federal urban renewal programs that bulldozed historic districts in most American cities during the 1960s and 1970s. It happened through private capital, specifically the Bass family oil fortune. Starting in the 1980s, Bass Brothers Enterprises quietly acquired downtown properties and funded restoration as a deliberate project, treating Fort Worth's core as something worth saving when the national planning consensus said otherwise. The same city added world-class cultural infrastructure, the Kimball Art Museum, designed by Louis Kahn, the Modern Art Museum by Tadao Ando, the Amon Carter Museum, and Water Gardens by Philip Johnson. For a city that brands itself as Cowtown, Fort Worth possesses architectural and institutional sophistication, rivaling cities with triple its national visibility. But Sundance Square operates as a contained exhibition, not a citywide philosophy. Fort Worth's overall metropolitan form remains one of the most car-dependent, low-density regions in America, with roughly 2,400 people per square mile compared to San Francisco's 18,000. The walkable downtown exists as an urban island surrounded by highways, strip malls, and subdivision sprawl. Fort Worth didn't reject urbanism or embrace it, it built both simultaneously as separate, contradictory systems running in parallel. If Sundance Square is Fort Worth's carefully curated pedestrian-friendly illusion, the city's outer edges are its terrifying, unregulated reality. In standard urban planning, a city usually picks a lane. It either densifies its urban core to support public transit, or it completely surrenders to the highway, hollowing out the center for endless suburban sprawl. Fort Worth looked at those two opposing philosophies and decided to aggressively pursue both at the exact same time. While preserving its history in the center, Fort Worth is expanding outward at an almost incomprehensible pace. The city is annexing massive tracts of prairie land, building endless, sprawling suburban subdivisions that stretch for miles to the horizon. But the true anomaly isn't the residential sprawl. It is what the city built in its northern reaches. Enter Alliance, Texas. This is a massive 27,000-acre master-planned logistics and industrial hub. To put that into perspective, that is a concrete ocean of Amazon fulfillment centers, FedEx distribution hubs, and manufacturing plants so large it defies traditional civic zoning. At the very center of this massive supply chain empire sits the world's first dedicated industrial airport. Normal cities build airports to move citizens. Fort Worth built a massive parallel aviation ecosystem purely to move boxes, operating almost entirely independently of the passenger-focused DFW airport nearby. This is the ultimate urban planning paradox. Fort Worth is operating as two completely different cities simultaneously. On one hand, you have a highly praised pedestrian-first urban core that feels like a European plaza. On the other, you have a massive car-dependent logistics empire that swallows the landscape. It does not choose between walkable urbanism and brutal industrial sprawl. It aggressively pursues both. This bifurcated identity violates every fundamental rule of cohesive city design, yet it has made Fort Worth one of the fastest-growing major cities in the United States. Dallas is vertical, corporate, and built for international visibility. Fort Worth is horizontal, industrial, and thrives in the shadow. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex is a naming convention that masks fundamental opposition rather than partnership. Dallas cultivated Fortune 500 headquarters, finance towers, and a cosmopolitan image that deliberately distances itself from Texas stereotypes. Fort Worth doubled down on exactly what Dallas rejected, maintaining working cattle stockyards with daily tourist cattle drives, preserving where the West begins branding, and treating cowboy boots as acceptable business attire. This is not accidental differentiation. Fort Worth recognized it could not compete with Dallas on corporate prestige or media dominance, so it played an entirely different economic game. While Dallas pursued white-collar headquarters, Fort Worth captured aviation and aerospace operations, Bell Helicopter, Lockheed Martin facilities, and American Airlines maintenance bases. While Dallas built financial services infrastructure, Fort Worth constructed Alliance, Texas as a logistics empire. The cities do not complement each other. They occupy separate economic universes that happen to share a region. Even the infrastructure reveals the competition. DFW International Airport sits geographically between the cities because neither would accept the other claiming it. The location was negotiated as neutral ground, preventing either from winning. Fort Worth built Alliance Airport decades later as a parallel system it could fully control. The rivalry is not cooperation, it is armed peace. Fort Worth's national invisibility became its strategic advantage. Dallas absorbs media attention, corporate scrutiny, and the expectations that come with being a recognized major city. Fort Worth operates with almost no national oversight, free to pursue contradictory development without criticism. No one watches closely enough to question why the same municipality contains Philip Johnson museums and 27,000-acre cargo airports. By accepting that most Americans will never think about Fort Worth, the city gained freedom to say yes to everything simultaneously: historic preservation and ruthless sprawl, walkable urbanism and car-dependent logistics hubs, cultural sophistication, and performed cowboy authenticity. Fort Worth doesn't resolve contradictions, it weaponizes them. Dallas wins the spotlight. Fort Worth wins by hiding from it, building a parallel infrastructure empire while its neighbor handles the performance of being a recognizable American city. Fort Worth had every geographic disadvantage, isolated by forest, abandoned by its founding institution, blocked from the railroad, and permanently overshadowed by a wealthier, more visible neighbor. Most cities facing those conditions disappear into footnotes. Fort Worth survives by simply refusing the premise that any of it matters. The city learned in 1876, grading railroad tracks by hand, that institutions don't save you. Geographic advantages don't guarantee success. Coherent planning doesn't determine outcomes. What determines outcomes is the willingness to operate without permission, build contradictory systems simultaneously, and embrace whatever chaotic opportunity presents itself regardless of whether it fits an urban planning textbook. Fort Worth commodified its rough history instead of erasing it, preserved a museum-quality downtown, while annexing Prairie for cargo airports, and turned national invisibility into strategic freedom. It operates as two incompatible cities wearing a single municipal designation, refusing to choose between urbanism and sprawl, sophistication and authenticity, visibility and expansion. Most powerful cities succeed through natural advantages, deep water ports, railroad junctions, resource deposits. Fort Worth succeeds through sheer stubborn adaptation, saying yes to everything incompatible and surviving purely through relentless refusal to die. That's the opposite of how cities should work, and that's exactly why it does.